Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I think we're ready to begin. Well, welcome. Wonderful to see you all here tonight. I was just reminded that event this event has been a long time in coming. You may remember, some of you, that we tried to organize this just before 2020 with COVID, and then we tried to organize it again when we thought COVID had disappeared and hadn't. And now we're finally here, so we're really, really pleased to be here with everybody tonight. My name's Annie Harris. I'm Director of Essex Heritage, and you've seen a few of our little slides and some of our programs up here, but I just want to say we're a regional nonprofit. We work on preserving and promoting the heritage assets of Essex County. That's the whole North Shore and Lower Merrimack Valley. We do a number of programs from trail development to youth job corps programs, educational programs. One of our newer initiatives is the Revolutionary War 250th anniversary, specifically in Essex County. We've teamed up with Mass 250 and really pleased to be working with them on commemorating and celebrating the American Revolution and the role that Essex County, the very prominent role that Essex County and residents played in the buildup to the war and also through the war. And we're here for a lot of fun tonight, but there's also a serious purpose in kind of remembering what happened 250 years ago, the debates, the angst they must have gone through about whether to break away or not. Some people who broke away, flaky, okay. Some surprising people who were patriots, some who were loyalists. Very, very interesting debates, particularly these days when we're looking again at who's American, who's patriotic, who's included, who isn't. So there's both a fun and a serious side of that. But the fun is really what we're here tonight to talk about. Where did the Navy start? And I think it's also to bring recognition to the maritime resources and seamen, particularly in those days, and how really important they were to the American Revolution, to securing our freedom, to securing arms, armaments, to make it all happen. And these are very ephemeral assets we have, maritime assets, and it's easy to forget how really important this region and those players were, and certainly General Glover, how important he was. He's just gotten some recent recognition, which is great. And I want to give a shout out to some of the people trying to save his house, his farmhouse in Swampscott. They're here tonight. So please feel free to support them. They're really working hard. And I would invite you also to keep looking at the programs that we have coming up through this year and next year. We have a site, Essex Heritage, Rev 250 Essex, or just Google Rev 250 Essex, and a lot of things coming up. I want to just mention June 5th, there's a very interesting talk by Alex Kane in Topsfield. Not only is he a very lively speaker, but it's the talk is at the Meredith Farm, which is a private farm in Topsfield. The owner there is a collector of military documents and memorabilia and artifacts, and he will be showing some of these very important artifacts, including things from the American Revolution that night as well as the talk. So I invite you to come. So with that, I think I've gone on enough, and let me just now introduce our moderator tonight, Dave Olson. I think most of you know Dave. He's the former longtime editor of the Salem News. He told us to remember it's not just Salem, but it's in many other communities around here, particularly Beverly and Marblehead, who he's unbiased, without fear or favor tonight. He's also a longtime history buff, whose parents took him on spring vacation trips to Revolutionary War battlefields and historic sites instead of Disney World. No bitterness there, right? I think he appreciates it now, but I'm not sure then. He says he knows the difference between John Glover and John Paul Jones, but you can quiz him on that later. And with that, David is going to run the program tonight, and introduce our two debaters and keep it all fair and above board, right?
Can everybody hear me? Excellent. In just a full disclosure, I do live in Beverly, but I moved there. Yeah. I'll show myself out. Just quickly, on tonight's format, we're gonna have the gentleman come up and give introductory remarks. They'll each get about 15 minutes. Then we'll sit down. We'll have a back and forth discussion with some questions for about 25 minutes, and then after that, we'll take questions from the crowd. But first, I want to introduce our two esteemed panelists. David Goss enjoys history and is an author of 7 books on American colonial and maritime history, and happens to teach history at Gordon College. A Massachusetts native, he was not born at Beverly Hospital. However, his wife and all his children were born there. Once upon a time, he actually served as executive director of the Beverly Historical Society. And in the other corner, Charlie Newhall was not born in the Mary Alley Hospital, nor was he in the U.S. Navy. Neither was his Marblehead-raised father, who was in the Air Force. He happens to be a United States history teacher at St. John's Prep in Danvers, and does know how to sail, and has done so well east of Down East into the Canadian Maritimes, where he claims never to have privateered. However, he does know the response to down bucket. So we're going to have them come up in a minute. But first, they both agreed we're going to do a little bit of a context. I think most of the people here know the context of this debate, but just so we're all on the same page. In examining why either Marblehead or Beverly should be regarded as the birthplace of the American Navy, it's important to understand what combination of factors or circumstances were involved in the year 1775 that might have brought an American Navy into existence in the first place. Prior to that year, the only Navy that held sway along the coastline in New England, and indeed the entire eastern seaboard of North America, was the British Navy, the largest and most powerful of all European navies at the time. For a group of American colonists who, as of 1775, were still considered British subjects, to attempt to establish a rival naval force of their own must have been viewed as a very risky, and one might even say foolhardy, venture. The stage was set for the siege of Boston following the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. Thousands of Minutemen and many local militia units from all over New England arrived in Boston following the British defeat. The British Army in Boston was quickly encircled by fortifications and camps. Cut off from all land routes, the most expedient way to supply the thousands of British troops and resident civilian population was to establish a regular supply route from Boston from Halifax, Nova Scotia, and occasionally from England. As long as British supply ships were free to visit Boston without interference, the siege of Boston would continue. This unfortunate fact became immediately evident to General George Washington, who arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to take full command of the newly established Continental Army on July 3, 1775. The American Army was now no longer a miscellaneous gathering of militia, but a congressionally authorized force, given the task of driving the British, their troops, and their substantial fleet of ships out of Boston. For this reason, he devised a plan to employ a small fleet of privately owned vessels, armed, outfitted, and leased from their owners at congressional expense, to represent the Continental Army on the high seas. Their task would be to intercept British vessels carrying war materials and supplies bound for Boston, thus denying British troops stationed there and providing much-needed war materials to this severely undersupplied Continental Army. To help him accomplish this arduous and challenging task, he turned to one of his trusted senior staff officers, Colonel John Glover of Marblehead, commander of the 14th Continental Regiment, also known as Glover's Regiment. And that is where we're going to begin. And first up tonight is David Goss.
Thanks, David. Hello. Can you all hear me too? Okay. This evening's discussion, or debate, focuses on the question, what place is the actual birthplace of the American Navy? The town of Marblehead, city of Beverly. At the very heart of this question is the other question, what do we mean when we say birthplace? Once we understand the meaning of what a birthplace is, then we may proceed to determine which of these two communities qualifies as the birthplace of the American Navy. According to the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, a birthplace is simply a place where someone or something is born or is originated and serves as its literal place from which it is to come to life. It did not exist as an entity prior to being in that place, and it does exist as an entity after its creation there. In other words, a birthplace is a specific geographic location, a building or a community where something happened and someone and someone's experiences start life. It is, in short, a place of beginning. If I were to use a common and accepted example, I might say to you, the birthplace of American motorized flight is Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Or perhaps Salem, Massachusetts was known, and most especially has been recognized recently, as the birthplace of the National Guard. Because here it was that the so-called East Regiment, or Flower of Essex, held their muster on Salem Common, following the General Court's order to create a contingent of civilian soldiers on December 13th, 1636, marking the origin of the National Guard of today. In all the above previous examples of birthplaces, no one is particularly concerned where the various people involved in the above birthplace events came from, or what other towns might have contributed personnel or materials. The only concern is, where did the famous event for which these births are known take place? So, I ask you, where did the naval fleet ordered by George Washington in 1775 gather together and form a revolutionary naval base? Where did these Beverly station vessels get refitted and armed? And where did they receive their crews? And where were their final commissions received? And if I could ask, from where did all these vessels ultimately sail? The answer is that simply all the evidence that the creation of this naval fleet only took place in the port of Beverly, at Glover's Wharf on the Beverly waterfront. And when the Hannah, Washington's first naval vessel, first sailed on its maiden voyage as a continental cruiser to face the British on the morning of September 5th, 1775, the Hannah sailed out of Beverly Harbor, not out of Marblehead Harbor. And I contend that that does make it the birthplace of the Navy. One important side note to all of this discussion about the birth of the Navy, and I want to mention this right now, is I might add that although the main actor and prime mover in the process of actually organizing and supplying Washington's naval base with ships and men and supplies was Colonel John Glover. I'm sorry to reveal to you another lesser-known Salem birthplace claim that can be made. Salem, Massachusetts is the birthplace of Colonel John Glover, who is actually a native of Salem, not Marblehead. Which, in the midst of putting this together, prompted me to think, maybe Salem ought to be possibly the birthplace of the American Navy, and we had it much more confusing. So, I just wanted to mention that he was never born at Mary Alley Hospital. He spent his early days here, not in Marblehead. So the question again, once again, where is the place where Washington's naval base took form? Where was it equipped? With lumber and ship's carpenters and cannons and vessels and munitions and crews and laborers and sailors. And as you know, my position is that the birthplace, where all these maritime activities took place, creating the first congressionally authorized and funded American naval fleet, was Glover's Wharf in Beverly. Picking up where our moderator just left off, let me finish the story. When General Washington had been appointed by Congress in June of '75 and arrived in Cambridge to assume command of the Continental Forces in Cambridge on July 3rd, '75, the besieging Patriots had no naval forces of any kind available to them to counteract the constant flow of supplies coming into Boston. They just didn't. On the morning of August 26th, if you're following the chronology, after much deliberation, 1775, after much deliberation, Washington sent a request to meet with Colonel John Glover, the son of Salem, who at that time was commander of the 14th Regiment, Marblehead Regiment, a fine group, to discuss the immediate need for the fitting out, he said, for the fitting out of armed ships to capture British transports. This was, of course, for two reasons: to deny the British their supplies, and also to, as our moderator pointed out, provision and resupply his own deeply depleted army. They needed supplies desperately. The result of this deliberation with Colonel Glover was the rather controversial final decision to act on his own authority without congressional permission as Commander-in-Chief of Continental Forces, and to grant Continental Army commissions to the commanders of his proposed fleet of ships. All commanders to be hand-chosen by Colonel John Glover, with help from John Manley, and to use Continental or Congressional funds to finance what would become called Washington's Navy. So in a way, it's a naval force that is serving the needs of the Army with Army commissions. Since the actual geographic location of where the key contributing people and vessels are from is considered important to this discussion, I just want to remind you all that the founder of this idea, the paymaster underwriting all of the maritime laborers and craftsmen and war materials for this expensive naval base to be built in Beverly, as well as its fleet, is actually George Washington. It's his idea, controversial though it might be, and it was his money. So, I should mention, he's from Pope's Creek, Virginia. And I suppose that means that Pope's Creek could lay claim to being one of the birthplaces of the American Navy. Colonel Glover was instructed by Washington of Pope's Creek to lease a small fleet of local vessels, most of them former West Indian traders, most of them topsail schooners, from their original owners, most of whom, not surprisingly, were Marblehead merchants and Marblehead ship owners of Glover's acquaintance, and gather the leased vessels together in a single, well-protected, this is a quote, well-protected location where they could be structurally modified, re-rigged, refitted, repaired if necessary, and armed with cannons, munitions, and supplied with military provisions. Like privateers, crews of Washington's Navy were promised shares of booty as incentive, totaling up to 1/3 of the value of all captured prize cargoes, which might have a military purpose. The first of these leased and reconditioned vessels was naturally Glover's own vessel, Hannah, 78 tons burden, which was taken over by the Continental Army for refurbishment on August 24th, 1775. The well-protected, so-called well-protected, port harbor for this naval activity was Beverly. In this way, the seed of the birth of the Navy was sown. Now, important point. As to why exactly the port of Beverly was selected by Washington and Glover and John Manley as the best location for this naval activity, their reasons are as follows. Number one, the harbor of Beverly was as yet uncharted. A very important point, making it dangerous for unfamiliar vessels to attempt entry to either attack the Washington Naval Fleet or to recapture prize vessels that might be snugly anchored in Beverly Harbor. It had only one safe deep channel, and even that was hard to negotiate at low tide, as they would find out. Number two, from a purely practical point of view, as a newly established Beverly Wharf owner, Colonel Glover could make excellent use of his own newly constructed and expanded crib wharf and his new warehouse facility, which could be leased to the Continental Army and earn him some additional income. And it did. Number three, Beverly was a large, safe port very close to the common sailing routes used by transports and supply ships coming down from Canada to Boston. And it offered less risk to attacking American vessels and a quick escape home to safety if pursued by the British. Washington and Colonel Glover were both very uncertain of the safety, and this is one of the other reasons, and I don't mean this in any way to be disrespectful. Love Marblehead Harbor. But Marblehead Harbor at that point was a location that was despite the service of Fort Sewell, was a location that was potentially attackable. It was closely watched by the HMS Lively, which was a 20-gun sloop of war stationed just off the coast, and it was very vulnerable. So there was a very practical military reason, strategic reason why Marblehead did not get the nod as the base for Washington's fleet. For all these reasons, Glover and Washington chose Beverly instead of Marblehead as the incubator for the fleet. So what exactly happened in Beverly between August 24 and into October to make the so-called birthplace of the American Navy? The short answer is that privately owned American vessels were sailed to Beverly Harbor, most of them were owned by Marbleheaders, and ship's carpenters, ship chandlers, riggers, blacksmiths, and all their apprentices were recruited from Marblehead, Salem, and Beverly to undertake renovations preparing the proposed fleet for their military service. By September 2nd, 1775, General Washington, the Virginian in charge of the project, followed Glover's advice and handed to Glover's son-in-law, Captain Nicholas Broughton, the first commission in the Continental Army to serve as a ship's captain in command of the newly refitted Hannah. And this is, in part, what Broughton's actual orders had to say. Quote, "You being appointed a captain in the Army of the United Colonies of North America are hereby directed to take command of a detachment of said army and proceed on board the schooner Hannah at Beverly, lately fitted out and equipped with arms, ammunition, and provisions at the Continental's expense. 2. You are to proceed as the commander of said schooner immediately on a cruise against such vessels as may be found on the high seas or elsewhere, bound inwards or outwards, to or from Boston in the service of the ministerial army, and to take and seize all such vessels laden with soldiers, arms, ammunition, or provisions for or from that said army, or which you have good reason to suspect they are in such service." In other words, Captain Broughton's suspicions were an important part of his orders. This commission granted Captain Broughton a great deal of freedom, one might say leeway, and discretion in deciding who to attack, where to attack, and how to attack. Captain Nicholas Broughton and his crew, consisting mostly of Marblehead soldiers recruited from the 14th Regiment, set sail from Beverly Harbor, Massachusetts, leaving Glover's Wharf, and sailed out of Beverly Harbor in the newly refurbished Hannah, bearing a formidable array of four 4-pound guns. On September 5th, 1775, as previously noted, this day, September 5th, 1775, marks the beginning of Washington's American Navy and might be regarded as its birthday. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, we'll hear from Charlie Newhall.
Well, it's a nice conceit. Birthplace, okay. Welcome. I'm glad you're all here to learn about the founding of the Continental, the American, some sort of Washington's Navy, and where it was born and took off. First of all, it is always difficult to prove, and I am not really sure that the bragging rights extend beyond the desires of firsts, the desires of a Chamber of Commerce for promotion. I hope we are all proud of our place of origin and happy to ride the wave of enthusiasm for those moments of fame that illuminate our town, or the many, many moments of fame for those of you from Salem. Fame? Marblehead and Beverly are no exceptions. We like to talk about American exceptionalism, but perhaps there is a Marblehead exceptionalism, I would argue. Professional and lay historians, pundits and promoters have all chimed in on the question of the birthplace of the American Navy. We just heard one, a professional historian. There are at least 6 or perhaps 7 places so claiming. Perhaps we'll get to those later, but they include, for example, Philadelphia, which the Navy itself recognizes, Rhode Island and its assembly, which made a call on that same day you mentioned, August 26, 1775, for, quote, the building and equipping of an American fleet. Whitehall, New York, where Benedict Arnold, remember him? Benedict Arnold assembled a fleet, and others. Machias is my favorite. Machias and the Battle of Machias is a wonderful story, and again, perhaps we'll get to that later too. Boats have hailing ports on their stern, I believe, yes? And I suspect, although I don't know because I've looked at the evidence and I can't find any evidence that the Hannah had a hailing port. But I suspect the hailing port is important because, after all, some of you may have boats, and you might keep them in boatyards that are not in the town in which you sail out of or that you call home. Hailing ports are important. And the heel tapper Hannah, which, although it is debatable whether she was a 78-ton or a 45-ton schooner, we're not sure, although an authority no lesser than Philip Chadwick Smith, who some of you may know, and his model is just outside here in the hallway or in the museum of the visitor center. Chad Smith, who was an historian at the Peabody Essex Museum and later went on to the Philadelphia Naval Museum, argues that it was a 45-ton schooner, together with Russell Knight. And it's shown in the Colonial Ledger, or Glover's Colonial Ledger, that's at the Marblehead Historical Society, to be a Marblehead boat. Again and again, it is mentioned as a Marblehead boat. She was not the only schooner out of Marblehead by the name of Glover and by the name of Hannah, owned by Glover. Just to confuse us all, there was another Hannah owned by another John Glover. So let's make sure we have that straight. The Hannah of which we speak was owned by John Glover, as opposed to the other one, which was owned by Jonathan Glover, and was part of the fishing fleet for most of the year, and then went to Barbados with fish and timber in the winter, returning with sugar and rum. Thank you, the privateers, wherever they are. This is important because her captain and crew were well versed in the navigation of the high seas. In fact, the so-called Crocker Archive, Uriah Haskell Crocker gave a number of years ago, there is evidence to suggest that the Hannah was involved in bringing gunpowder to Massachusetts from Barbados or Bermuda, it's unclear from the record, as early as 1775, which might suggest that there's a historical project there to see if they're bringing gunpowder early on. The case for Marblehead is clear. I contend that Marblehead is not only the home port of Hannah and the hometown of most of the sailor Marines on the Hannah's only 2 encounters, perhaps we'll get to those, but that Marblehead leaders, and here's the key, Marblehead leaders incubated the idea of a navy with George Washington and implemented it with its official authorization of Washington and the Second Continental Congress given to Marbleheaders. And the key here is that ideas are born. They have a birth of some kind. Somebody has to come up with an idea, and that would be its birth. And its birthplace was in the minds and hearts of Marbleheaders. Marbleheaders, in fact, as John Adams said, the war began in the hearts and minds before a single drop of blood was shed at Lexington or Concord. And one of those towns where those hearts and minds were changed was Marblehead. I rely on the arguments of the historian Christopher Magra. I do teach history at St. John's Prep, and it's important to look at secondary scholarship and take it seriously, because after all, you want to stand on their shoulders. He wrote a book called The Fisherman's Cause and 2 articles, Fishermen, Fish Merchants, and the Origins of the American Navy, and Soldiers Bred to the Sea, Maritime Marblehead, Massachusetts, and the Origin and Progress of the American Revolution. They both explicate an argument about the military conversion of fishing vessels as central to creating a navy. And who knew how to do that but Marblehead fishermen who have been sailing those boats? Magra, together with naval historian Vincent Dowell as early as 1955 and Chester Hearn as recently as 1995, who wrote George Washington's Schooners, points out that John Glover and the Marblehead merchants in general helped Washington develop the idea, quote unquote. Now, we've had a little bit of context, but I want to give you a little bit more. The British had 29 warships from Florida to Nova Scotia in June of 1775. 8 of those were in New England. By October, they would add more and have 35 along that coastline, and were working hard to blockade any kind of merchant activity. Under the auspices of Samuel Graves, New England seemed to be shut down. John Adams, attending the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia, collaborated the idea with Christopher Gadsden as early as June 7 of 1775, when he said, "We may get a fleet of our own," and then corresponded immediately with none other than Marbleheader Elbridge Gerry. Gary? Jerry. I say it both ways. Tell me, Marbleheaders, which way is it? Gary. Thank you. Why Marblehead? Magra points out the importance of the little-known British law, little known to most people, passed in Parliament in March 1775, the Restraining Act. More odious to fishermen, this act placed a moratorium on the fishing grounds starting as late as July 1775, and immediately unemployed everybody, so to speak, in Marblehead. In fact, MAGRA shows that 78% of the adult males in Marblehead, quote, performed some military service at sea during the Revolution, enthused by their ire against the Restraining Act. As MAGRA argues, fishermen from Marblehead, the first and foremost fishing port of all the 13 British colonies on the eve of the Revolution, made the transition to fighting men during the war. The port town employed more men, more vessels, and larger amounts of capital than any other port in the region. If fishermen were joining the Revolution anywhere in colonial America, they were doing it in Marblehead. So again, my point is the enthusiasm of Marbleheaders and their skill, their ability to know where to go and how to handle these ships led to an onslaught of people joining in to fight in this battle. And the Hannah was equipped with at least 36 sailors in addition to the captain mentioned, Brogan, and they were a vast majority from Marblehead. I think there's at least one from Lynn, and I think there may be 2 from Salem. Yep. It is clear in the George Washington papers from 1775 that he was engaged in active thinking about how to undercut the British occupiers in Boston, and how they would undercut. He was worried about how he could help undercut those ordnance ships that were bringing things in. And that's the story of Machias, where they're attempting to bring firewood, essentially, to Boston, in any case. He hoped to intercept them and prevent the British from resupplying and acquiring any papers, that's the key part too, any papers on board such vessels. In fact, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress had already engaged John Glover as early as June 20, 1775, to identify fishing vessels that could be converted. He found 5 or 6, including the Hannah, and 4 others that were renamed the Franklin, the Hancock, the Lee, and the Warren. It may be argued, in fact, that Glover had established a wharf in Beverly, and he had. Any good businessman looked for a good, safe place to have his ships. In November 1774, he had taken his ship Hannah there to outfit it. The captain, Nicholas Brogan, and those some 36 sailors had gone there enthusiastically from Marblehead. Now, you're going from your hometown to where your ship is, and then you're going out to sea. I'm saying that it's the idea of the Navy, that is what is the birthplace here. Place is in the hearts and minds of the people.
In your mind.
Marblehead and its enthusiasm was supported by the business sense of John Glover, the political sense of Elbridge Gary, thank you. And it is that really started the idea of the Navy. That said, I think we should go to questions that you might have. To Marblehead. Down bucket.
Thank you both. That settled it, right?
Hearts and minds.
So if you go and you Google birthplace of the American Navy, what pops up is Philadelphia, and we all know that everything on the internet is true. But you talked a little bit more. You talked a little bit about the other locations that have some sort of claim to the birthplace of the American Navy. Philadelphia, obviously, Providence, Crown Point, and I think if we were able to ask Benedict Arnold if he was the father of the American Navy, he would most certainly say yes. But his action with Ethan Allen predated John Glover, I believe, right?
After. After.
Actually, it was in May of 75.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is a chance for you both to talk a little bit about what is lacking in those other claims of those other cities cities and communities that say they're the birthplace of the American Navy. Maybe we'll give you a chance. You want to start?
Sure. I think Machias. Yeah, I was just going to mention Philadelphia again briefly, and just say, Philadelphia. The discussion in the fall of 1775 was how we're going to create this, and of course we all know that John Paul Jones, right, ends up being, quote, he claims to be the father of the American Navy, but it is actually John Adams, influenced in large part by what's going on in Massachusetts Bay, that really pushes the agenda. They create a committee in in Philadelphia, and then they look to outfit ships, and they outfit 2 ships and eventually 4 ships in Philadelphia. So it is Congress's authorization of those that is the claim that is made. Yeah.
And that, if you're following along with the chronology, what goes on here in Salem is in August and September.
Right.
What goes on in Philadelphia is in October.
Yeah.
So it's considerably, 2 months later.
Right. Machias is earlier. Machias is in earlier in 1775. I think it's June, right? 1775. And in Machias, merchant ships are going from Boston up to Machias
For lumber.
For lumber, and that's their whole main objective. But the British, Graves, sends along an escort. And
the Margaretta.
The Margaretta, and they arrive in Machias, and the merchants already have relationships with people in Machias. They go ashore, but the people in Machias seem to be a little reluctant, so they end up having a big debate essentially, and the people in Machias finally agree to give them some lumber. And there's sort of a respite. There seems to be a little anxiety, but there's a respite, and they all go to church on Sunday. And on Sunday, some of those who don't want to give this lumber to this firewood to go to these people, the British in Boston, decide that they're going to attack church where the captains of the ships are at church praying. And they come in, and one of the captains actually runs out and goes to his ship. The other one runs out the back window and goes into the woods, where he stays in the woods for a good 24 hours, hiding from these people.
They take his ship.
They take his ship, exactly. And that ship, therefore, it becomes the first ship of the American Navy.
A very inglorious way to begin. But I feel bad for the poor midshipmen on board the Margaretta. The Margaretta was just a ship. It was a tender, and it was only going up to accompany these people to Machias. And this young fella, he could have been, what was he, 20? I mean,
20.
He had no business in charge of a vessel. His name was Moore, I believe, and he winds up being attacked by 2 angry Maine schooners with men literally armed with axes and pitchforks. And a few muskets.
And he has trouble sailing, so he's trying to negotiate his way out, and he hits another boat.
He's dragging boats behind him. He's dragging
spar
boats
is coming
behind
down.
He can't make any headway at all. And finally he says, let's cut the boats. But by the time he tries to, they've already caught up with them, and they're on board. After being 19 or 20 years old and saying, so I'm the reason why the naval war began.
We do have to have a moment of sobriety here. He is shot, actually, and does die in that event. Just to lighten the load.
Thanks, Charlie.
Now, what about Ethan Allen and Benedict?
Yeah, I mean, this is a story that I think many of you are aware of. We always hear about Ethan Allen taking Fort Ticonderoga, right? And then having the cannons of Fort Ticonderoga dragged over, all sorts of hills through the Berkshires to help arm Boston Harbor and Dorchester Heights. Well, what we don't think about is Ethan Allen was actually very tight with Benedict Arnold. They worked together. And right near the Crown Point, there is this, is it a Skene?
Yeah.
What's the name of the there's this
Skanesboro, that sounds right.
Skanesboro, thank you.
Yeah.
And there was a lumber yard there, and they were building vessels on Lake Champlain, and Benedict Arnold captures one of the ships that had been built there, and renames it the Liberty.
That sounds right.
The very first. Now remember, this is in May of 1775. Before anything else Of all people, Benedict Arnold. And he captures this little civilian vessel. I think it was the Katy, or it was.
I thought it was called the Skane, or something. It's named after the town.
Yeah, he names it the Liberty.
Yep.
And Benedict Arnold takes possession of this vessel, and it becomes the very first. He winds up with 2. And then he goes north to St. John's, across Lake Champlain, goes to the north of Lake Champlain, goes to Quebec, and actually attacks a fort. They actually aren't making enough headway, and he has to, they get kind of becalmed on the lake, and he puts his men in boats, and they row their way the rest of the way to the north of Lake Champlain. But he claimed that was the first naval engagement of the American forces against the British in May.
And he's building a fleet. He calls it his fleet.
Yeah. I mean, he basically controls Lake Champlain with a navy that he is completely responsible for.
So you just told us Burlington, Vermont is the birthplace?
Well, White Plains, New York, because of his involvement there, that's the basis, really, I think, for the Whitehall claim is based on that.
The Whitehall claim is based on
It's
that.
based on that.
New England's West Coast.
Yeah, I don't think Burlington has any claim at all. Although the way things are going, they'll probably come up with one. So you never know.
So let's segue from Benedict Arnold to John Glover for a second.
Well, could I just interject one
Absolutely.
other thing? We haven't mentioned Rhode Island. And, I think that puzzles people, because we talk about Washington is engaged in these negotiations with his officers in August. And he understands something that everyone, I think we can all agree on. He had a very large army. Actually, it's been estimated to be about 14,000. I mean, ridiculously large number. But the problem was he had 36 barrels of powder.
Right. That's right.
Which actually boiled down to 8 rounds a man, which is just not enough to have a successful campaign against a British army of 8,000 guys. That's just not going to do it. So he heard from a fellow named Harris, Harris. He heard from a gentleman from Harris who had just returned from a voyage to Bermuda. Maybe he was on vacation. I don't know. It's a nice place to go.
The first Bermuda race.
Well, it might have been to get gunpowder. Because in Bermuda, there was, and why the British did not more heavily guard this, I don't get it. But there is a magazine at one end of the island of Bermuda with no military guard on it.
Yeah.
And Harris came back and says, I've been scouting out, because Bermuda was one of the sources for munitions. I've been scouting out Bermuda. There's this family called Tucker in Bermuda. They're sympathetic with our cause. And they will help us land at this isolated point of Bermuda, and they will give us help in breaking in. And Harris was ordered by Washington to take the Katy from Rhode Island. And that is the basis for and the governor said, go do this. Governor of Rhode Island, the province of Rhode Island, said, do this. So the Katy was sent not to confront the British Navy, but to do what Washington desperately needed, and that was, they actually came home with 128 barrels of gunpowder.
Yeah.
Can you imagine to go from an entire supply of 36? Still in all, 128 barrels is not an infinite amount, but it so greatly improved Washington's chances in laying siege to Boston. Because, of course, if those cannons from Ticonderoga were going to have any effect at all, you had to have munitions, you had to have gunpowder, you had to have ammunition. And Washington had the cannons, but had very little else to fight with.
And yet, when Washington gave his orders, which you read, to Glover and to Brogan to actually go out there, the agenda was really to intercept boats that were coming to supply Boston, rather than to engage in naval warfare. right? I mean, look at, as again, they're 4-4-pounders on the Hannah. You're not going very far with that.
Right.
So, and certainly against the Lively, not going to do well, right? Fortunately, the Lively went a different direction. The first time they actually went out out into Salem Sound. Salem Sound, that's Salem Sound, by the way. And as they're making their way out, they're out by Halfway Rock. The Lively spots them, and there's another smaller British ship that spots them, and they go and tuck in essentially in Cape Ann. They tuck in essentially at Eastern Point Yacht Club and go ashore for dinner. And the next morning they wake up and they see another ship there, and they sort of eye it. They go over there and they engage. They fire a shot into the Unity, and the Unity.
I have that story.
You want to do it? Go for it. Great.
Can I read you the story?
Yeah, great.
Okay, this is kind of a fun. Well, I think it's fun.
It's a fun story.
It is a fun story because you don't hear that much about this. Okay, here we go.
And Marbleheaders, be prepared. We're going to recover from this one. We're going to recover.
Okay, here we go.
I can get it started. You've got it.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah, good.
It's like story time, isn't it? And so, boys and girls, as to what exactly happened immediately after the sailing of the Hannah from her maritime birthplace in Beverly. Captain Nicholas Broughton provides us with a glimpse of the very first naval encounter in his report to General Washington. And I'm going to be quoting directly from this report. By the way, one of the things we've both tried to do here is give you good sources so that what we're telling you, I mean, yes, it's an interesting story, but it's not just a story. It's an important part of our history. And I think one of the things that we both hope is that everyone will go away feeling like they know the story a little bit better and they're a little more acquainted with the importance of the maritime contribution of these three towns, Salem, Marblehead, and Beverly, all of us. So.
Here, 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 here.
Okay. This is Broughton speaking. I sailed from Beverly last Tuesday at 10 o'clock with a fair wind and proceeded on my cruise. On the same day, at about 5 o'clock, I saw 2 ships of war. They gave me chase, and I ran into Cape Ann Harbor, a.k.a., that is to say, Gloucester. We use the word Cape Ann, Cape Ann is also known as Gloucester. I ran into Cape Ann Harbor, and I went out again that night at about sunset, and I stood to the southward. The next morning, I saw a ship under my lee quarter, and I perceived her to be a large ship. So I tacked, and I stood back for the land. Soon after, I put about and stood towards her again, and found her to be a ship of no force, that is, an unarmed ship. I came up with her and hailed, and asked her where she was from. She answered from Piscataqua, right? That would be, right? Portsmouth. And he was bound for Boston. I told him that he must bear away and go into Cape Ann, but being very loath to do so, I told him that he must, and if he did not, I would fire upon her. On that, she bore away, and I have brought her safe into Cape Ann Harbor, and I have delivered this ship and its prisoners and cargo under proper guard to your excellency, that's Washington, for further orders. This was the first wartime encounter and capture by America's first naval vessel.
Hence the birth of the American Navy in Gloucester?
Is anyone writing these down? Are we keeping track? It happened to be the ship Unity, a 300-ton, this is a large, by our standards of this time, a large vessel, a 300-ton merchantman.
Owned by?
Owned by New Hampshire merchant and member of the Continental Congress, John Langdon.
An American, a patriot.
He's a member of Congress, folks. And it was loaded with war materials.
He ends up in the Constitutional Convention. This guy's important. You could tour his house today up in Portsmouth.
It proved to be, the capture of this vessel actually proved to be a serious mistake for Captain Broughton. Capturing a ship owned by a member of Congress, even today, would not be considered a good thing to do. An embarrassment for Washington as well, and George Washington ordered that the Unity, now under guard at Cape Ann, be returned to her original owner, Congressman Langdon, without being tried, condemned, and declared a prize of war. Upon hearing of this, Captain Broughton, and I understand how he thinks.
Yeah.
Captain Broughton and his crew were terribly disappointed, since this meant that they lost their promised 1/3 share of the Unity's cargo.
That's the deal. You are going out there, the captain and crew get 1/3, another third gets sold, and a third of it goes to Congress.
Remember, we have no manufacturing going on here in the colonies. So we are literally dependent upon all the manufactured goods that are necessary to fight a war. We have to depend on the British to supply us with the materials to fight them. Which sounds like a strange business plan, doesn't it?
All of this certainly comes from George Washington's papers, because he's reporting back to George Washington.
In response to hearing that the Unity had to be returned, Captain Broughton wrote a letter to George Washington, stating that in view of the excessive cargo of provisions that they found on board the Unity, these were provisions that he claimed were supplies for a military force. He strongly suspected that it was more plausible that the Unity was in fact headed to Boston to help resupply the provision needs of the besieged British, and not an innocent trading voyage as claimed by Congressman Langdon, who claimed that it was on its way to the West Indies. Washington was unconvinced by Broughton's rather logical argument, and the decision to return the Unity to Langdon was confirmed. The majority of Hannah's crew, when informed of General Washington's decision to give the rich prize back, refused to do so.
Mutiny. Mutiny.
And they declared it was.
Mutiny.
On the very first voyage of the very first naval vessel in the American Navy, we have a mutiny.
They're taken in chains or cuffs of some
Right.
kind.
They come up to Gloucester, they put them all in
Cambridge.
chains,
Yep.
and they drag them to Cambridge.
To Cambridge, and the leader, Cyril, he is tried. They have a court-martial, and 39 lashes, and drummed out.
Right.
That was the deal. And some of the other leaders also would receive lashes, not quite as many, I think 20, and also
That's
drummed
right.
out.
Yep.
But Washington turns the tide. Maybe you've still got it there.
Well, he decides that, amazingly,
Yeah.
Captain Broughton is given command of Hannah again.
He is given command of Hannah, and Glover has sent a word to re-outfit
Right.
with Marbleheaders.
More Marbleheaders!
Marbleheaders, because they're the part of the original Navy.
All right, this seems to be a good time for a segue to talk about. Maybe we'll talk about competence.
Okay.
Let me just say,
This is too good a story to pass up.
it's important for Marbleheaders to know all but the leader were pardoned. Everybody was pardoned except Cyril. He got 39 lashes.
Right.
And
All right, so John Glover. The role of Colonel John Glover appears to be enormous in the story of Washington's Navy and its creation. How would you assess Glover's level of importance to the Revolution overall? And when do you start, Charles?
it's enormous. I mean, Glover's leadership in Marblehead at the beginning of the Navy, when Marblehead starts the Navy with Glover, and that is essential right there. But Glover has an interesting role. He will take his 14th Continental and turn it around, 14th Regiment, he'll turn it around to the 21st. Did I get that backwards? Glover's other way around. Yeah, it's the 21st Massachusetts, and he becomes the 14th.
That's right. Yes.
And he will then essentially be a right-hand person to Washington throughout the war, but particularly at key points in the Battle of New York, and then at that famous turning point that probably you all know, and that is at Trenton and crossing the Delaware.
Yeah.
But those aren't the only moments. The Mariners are key in helping him evacuate New York, for example,
Right.
as well as attack at Trenton.
Yeah. In 24 hours, let's just give you one amazing achievement, almost a miraculous achievement. At the end of Long Island, Washington's army is essentially back to the water. There was nowhere for them to go. The British were so convinced that there was nowhere for him to go that they actually waited for the next day to get into the American camp. Overnight, in less than 12 hours, Marblehead men, they stole every boat on the coastline. This is true. No, this is absolutely true. Miraculously, Glover and his men saved Washington and 9,000 of his men. They transported them with their horses and cannon across to New Jersey.
Right.
It's something that doesn't get enough. People have no idea how difficult it must. An entire army was dead. In fact, the revolution could have ended that night had the British attacked that night.
That's right.
But by giving us an extra 12 hours and Glover, they made it happen.
Indeed. Where's he from? Oh, Salem, isn't he?
Salem has produced such great men.
I would just say again, it's really important that we remember people like Glover and what they did, not only by telling the stories here and reading history, but also seeing the material culture that they lived in, the houses that they lived in, the streets that they walked.
We need to
And
save his house.
Historic preservation is important, and we need to save Glover's house.
We are all absolutely convinced that that is something that needs to be supported. And to think that we would lose the house of a man that had virtually saved the American Revolution several times.
More than once.
More than once. What are we thinking, really? You know?
I mean, you've really both only said like a sentence about crossing the Delaware. I mean, and that was.
You know the story, right? It's Christmas Eve, right?
Christmas Day.
You know, and the Germans are in Trenton. And what are Germans doing on Christmas? What do you think? They're drinking. Yes. And Washington knew he desperately needed a victory. What better victory could you have than to attack and beat an army of drunk Germans? And so they cross the Delaware.
The Delaware.
And they march to Trenton.
They marched not far up, not far away, down the river.
They attack the drunk Germans. And they win a tremendous victory, a battle, and it really helps to boost, if nothing else, it boosts morale.
They take 900 hostages. It's amazing. Not hostages, that's not the right word.
Prisoners of war.
Prisoners.
Did we actually use the word hostages? Oh, gosh. Aren't you glad you came tonight?
But they crossed twice. They crossed.
And then they went back.
Right. That's the amazing part. Yeah.
Charlie, that 9 miles to Trenton was almost tougher than crossing the Delaware.
Ah, indeed, I bet.
All right. So let's
snowing.
give some attention to Beverly.
Okay.
To what degree did the town of Beverly support the idea of serving as a revolutionary center of naval activity? And what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages?
Sure. Good. Well, first, one of the things we haven't talked at all about, and we kind of shy. I like to shy away from it myself. I think when we're writing about it, because we've all got a negative view of the positive economic benefits of war. I mean, when is the United States economy at its very best? Usually when we're in war. We're a nation that was built out of a war, and we are always kind of economically doing well when we fight a war. In any case, Beverly, like most of the communities, was struggling not just because their fishing was lagging, but of course the fact of the matter is it was always a hard-scrabble community in terms of its farming. Soil is not good here. The one hope that they had, and ultimately what does happen when it becomes a thriving, revolutionary base of operation, and not just for Washington's Navy, but for other for privateers as well, sailing for families like the Cabot family. Beverly's economy, as a result of their involvement and their patriotic involvement in the war, actually turns the economy around. It has, not to the extent that Salem would enjoy as a privateering port, but you've got one of the things that I think we all have to acknowledge, and we touched on it a little bit because we talked about the 1/3 share that would be divided in shares amongst the crew of Washington's naval force. But the fact of the matter is, privateering and the capturing of vessels on the high seas, and these were civilian vessels, as Charlie said, we're not out to fight the British Navy. We don't have a hope against the British Navy. But a lot of these well-armed, formerly privately owned civilian vessels are out there capturing, and by 1776, 77, 78, 79, the economy of Salem, the economy of Beverly, the economy of Marblehead does a turnaround, and privateering, I hate to call it, a profitable business.
And certainly Beverly, some of the privateers that are brought back there, bring back prizes of unimaginable history.
Unbelievably rich prizes.
For example, one of the ships that was brought in was captured in the Irish Sea by the Cabot Beverly privateer and brought to Beverly, and the cargo was put up for auction, and part of that cargo were books, philosophical books, that about 200 of them, which became the core of the Salem Athenaeum today. They were purchased by a collection of intellectuals, ministers, and others here in Salem and Beverly and Marblehead.
From the original owner.
Yep. Well, they were purchased from, from the privateer first, and brought to each other's houses, and they shared them. Eventually ends up as the Philosophical Library at the Salem Athenaeum. When the war was over, they wrote a letter to the owner of those books, and his name was Sir Richard Curwen, an Irishman, and part of the Royal Society in London and in Ireland, and said, "We have your books. We would like to pay you for them." He wrote back that he had already purchased all of the books again and put them on a ship from London to Dublin. The ship went down in a storm. And he had purchased them a third time and sent the books to Ireland, and they were safely in Ireland, and he said, "Keep the books that you have. They will do good for the new country."
All right, we're getting close to the end. We want to have time for questions. So let's talk conciliatory gestures. This is what David Ferrero, the former archivist of the United States, who we should know grew up in Beverly, but married a Marblehead woman. This is what he had to say about the issue. The residents of both Marblehead and Beverly bravely supported an American naval presence at the very beginning of the war, at a time when Americans were still debating whether it made sense to even engage the superior British fleet. Their courage facing the enemy as underdogs is one of the reasons that both towns are proud of their connection to the Hannah and its role in the Revolutionary War. With that in mind, is it possible to view the entire maritime community, stretching from Beverly Harbor to Marblehead Harbor, including here in Salem, as place of origin for the American Navy? And you can go first.
For my own personal point of view, is I think that would be a totally acceptable position to take, because I think so much credit, so much effort was made by the Marblehead community. It has to receive some of the honor of being responsible. I'm sorry, did I say something amiss?
I would agree that indeed it is a good position to take. And in fact, when you look at the second encounter of the Hannah, she only had 2 encounters, remind you.
Would you like to share that with us?
The second encounter of the Hannah was very much a Salem Sound event. And in that event, this was in October of 1775, the Hannah was sailing somewhere between Baker's Island and Little Misery Island when she spots a British ship, the Lively, which starts, is it Lively?
No,
It's I knew it was.
the Nautilus.
The Nautilus, that's right, the Nautilus. Spots the Nautilus. And the Nautilus is approaching, and she turns around and she says, well, I'm going to go into the harbor that's uncharted. I forget the name of it. But she's going to go into that harbor that's uncharted, and she's working her way in. The tide is going down. She figures she could cut in a little bit, and she cuts in at Beverly Cove and stops in the sand. Or what sand or mud there is. And they're still there. Sits there, and the Nautilus gets closer and closer, and they sort of say, well, what can we do? So quickly, the Marblehead sailors start scrambling and taking everything they can off of the Hannah, particularly those 4-pounders, and people from Beverly come to the rescue and help them take things off, and the Nautilus comes and starts firing, and they're firing right at the Hannah and missing. And the cannonballs are going right into Beverly and causing some serious damage.
That's right. It actually hits the church.
It's the church.
Yeah, I think they were using the steeple of the church as a sort of a target. But I think the point that we always wanted to make is that in this particular case, number one, as the tide is going out, the Nautilus also lands on a sandbar, which was underneath.
Right.
So they were in no better shape than the Hannah. Then as the tide is going out, the Nautilus starts to keel over.
Right.
And some of her guns are pointing into the mud. The other of their guns cannot be kept in place because they simply would be firing straight up.
This is the world's greatest Navy at the time.
This is the world's best European Navy. During this entire encounter, Salem militia come down to the Salem Willows. They line up their guns, and they open fire on the Nautilus, saying, well,
Indeed.
It's only 100 yards away. How bad could it be? The militia in Beverly gathers together as well. Both communities are firing at the Nautilus, and the best thing that can be said is that no one on the Nautilus was killed.
Right.
Which I think is sort of a reflection of the level of military skill of our militia. But when the tide comes in, the Nautilus raises sail, gets out of our harbor, and they never come back.
Right. Huzzah!
But
Sadly,
here-
it's the end of the Hannah
Here
as
we
well.
have an encounter that teaches the Royal Navy that this is not a place you want to come into. And members of the Marblehead community, the Beverly community, and the Salem community all do what? They work together. And I think that is a lesson to remember.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay. We do have time for some questions. Someone will be coming around with a microphone, I believe.
Yeah, we have microphones on both sides.
On both sides, if you want to come up and use a microphone.
Where are we coming up to?
Yep, there you go. Coming down.
So my question is, there's a story that I've heard a few whispers of that has never been published. I only read about it in an unpublished manuscript, that the Hannah may have been rebuilt and then potentially resold to the United States Navy. Have you heard that story? Do you give it any credence? Do you think that John Glover may have pulled a fast one on George Washington to try and recoup some additional funds by trying to resell a rebuilt Hannah?
I'm not familiar with that particular
I'm
article.
sorry, I don't know what might have happened when the Hannah finally was decommissioned. My understanding.
Someone back here knows the story.
I know the story.
Go ahead.
I work in the store at Beverly, so I know the story.
Please, tell us.
Is that,
Here comes the microphone.
Yep.
Hold on.
If you can hold on to the microphone, that helps. We're going to have it on TV.
Thank you.
So the story goes is that Washington was not made aware of this battle at all, and that the ship was taken back up to Glover's cousin, I believe, Fox, I want to say.
In Manchester by the Sea.
Yes, who then took the Hannah, and then the story goes is that a letter was written to Washington saying, "Hey, I found this wonderful new ship. It needs a lot of repairs, but I think we can afford to do it. So I think this would make a really great Navy ship. Let's go ahead and do it." And Washington's like, "Yeah, sure, approved." And it becomes the Lynch. And then the Lynch goes on and continues, and then it's eventually captured by the British, and then it gets auctioned off, and that's the end of the Hannah / the Lynch.
Yeah, the Lynch was one of the later vessels that gets brought in, and it has its own history unto itself. But that sounds about right. That sounds about like very often people found creative ways to make additional money.
Can we get a microphone down here?
Microphone?
Yep. Okay, well, one more here, and then we'll get to you.
Hi, I just want to support a little, why Marblehead is the birthplace of American Navy.
Huzzah.
And I really enjoyed your comments tonight, I learned a lot. But prior to Washington's Navy, as we know, was Hannah, Lee, Franklin, Warren, and Hancock. There were two privateers that sailed from Penrith Wharf in Marblehead. The Springbird was a 4-gun schooner, and the Polly, which was a 12-gun schooner. They were the privateers that went out before Washington acknowledged the Navy. Now, why Marblehead has been recognized by the Navy, and this is for your naval people. There were 3 USS Marbleheads. There was the gunboat Marblehead in 1861. There was the cruiser Marblehead trim gunboat in 1802. And there was the cruiser Marblehead, we all know, which was built in 1923. We go back to the original stickers of the schooners that sailed in Washington's Navy. The U.S. Navy saw fit to name vessels after the captains. And most of these vessels were destroyers. There was the USS, I can't see it, Glover,
Huzzah.
Manly,
Ah.
Tucker,
That's John Manley. Yeah.
Yep. Conwell, that was built in Boston, Salem, Brimbleton, Gregory, Crowninshield, and Boyle. They were all Marblehead sea captains that were from Marblehead, and the Navy saw fit to name those vessels after Marblehead.
A nail in the coffin for Marblehead. Absolutely right. Right down with Beverly. Done. Beverly's done with that.
That's a little town, Marblehead, and all those vessels. Now, the capping of all this, don't forget, the Constitution had something to do with Marblehead. And the Constitution, under siege, came to Marblehead in 1814.
I think the revolution was over by then.
However, they saw so much of Marblehead,
That's great.
they returned in 1931. And believe it or not, they returned again in 1997.
How many people were there at that event when they returned? Absolutely fantastic. Thank you. That is
Thank you.
terrific.
My question
Absolutely
is,
terrific.
how many times did the Constitution go to Beverly?
How many times do we want it stuck on a sandbar?
Thank you.
Well done.
But I have to cap this off and say, as much as I'm in favor of Marblehead, I have a wife of 62 years, and she's from Beverly.
Can we get the microphone down here?
Yep, we had one person with a question. I'm going
Sure.
to bring it down front.
I know Marblehead has a letter from Washington. I wonder if Beverly does, thanking them. Thanking them for their hospitality.
Beverly Historical Society might know. Our representative from Beverly Historical Society.
Hospitality letter, I don't know.
A thank you note?
Certainly Washington came through Marblehead, and there's
And
great
Beverly as
stories.
well.
And through Beverly as well?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm originally from Rhode Island, and there's an incident in the Providence River where there was a British ship that was chasing one of the privateers and got stuck on a sandbar in the Providence River in 1774, and it was called the Gaspee. And
The Gaspee.
Gaspee, I think it was. And Admiral Whipple from Rhode Island and some other people went out and they burned the Gaspee in the middle of the night. And they took I think they shot the captain and killed him. And it was considered one of the first, from Rhode Island, they considered it one of the first naval battles. So that's something to mention.
No, absolutely. It's more famous than you seem to. It's a pretty famous event, and it is one of the very first confrontations with the British Navy. Actually, she was a revenue cutter, the
That's
Gaspee.
right. Yeah.
But still in all, it was a British vessel. It was attacked by American civilians. It was destroyed. I mean, it was a big deal.
Yeah, and she was sort of lured over that bar.
Right.
I think it's at Warwick Neck, where she was.
Yes, at the end of the Providence River.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Thanks for bringing that up. That's right.
yeah.
Okay,
The Gaspee incident.
Yep.
we have one in the back and then down in the front.
I'm in large part going to be a conciliatory voice in all of this because first can be very dangerous. And I think we can all get on board with anywhere but Philadelphia. Anywhere but Whitehall, New York.
We're glad you're here, Jonathan.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I do want to point out something, though, which I would love to see rectified at some point. I think part of our problem stems from lack of support from our congressional delegation, not necessarily the modern one, because in the 1890s, the very first battle of the American Revolution, as designated by the United States Congress, is Point Pleasant, West Virginia. This is about the same time that they designated Philadelphia as the home of the U.S. Navy. Now, at the time, our senior senator from Massachusetts was Henry Cabot Lodge, who at the time was working on a serialized history of the American Revolution for Scribner's Magazine. And the illustrations of those, by the way, you can see in Historic Beverly, because they have the entire collection of that artwork, which was one of the few joys of COVID for me. But the
They're mostly black and white sketches, aren't they?
they're not black and white sketches. They are full color. I mean, they have a grayish tendency.
I mean a gray.
Yeah. I mean, they're definitely
gray tint.
built for magazine reprint. All the ones except Howard Pyle, which somebody in Delaware absconded with. But in the same issues of Scribner's Magazine that Henry Cabot Lodge is writing his history of the American Revolution while not voting on the first battle of the Revolution. Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great naval historian and strategist, is writing a history of naval operations in the American Revolution. And the very first story he writes about is about what's happening on Lake Champlain. And again, missed opportunity for Henry Cabot Lodge, who knew Alfred Thayer Mahan pretty well, to go and say, and of course, Lodge is from Beverly. So it makes you wonder, where was he in all of this? And can we, chastise him at this point in our lives?
I want to mention, since you brought it up, that Samuel Eliot Morison embraces Marblehead as the founding of the Navy.
He's my hero, so I can't question him. Any other questions? Anything else? Have you all learned something? Yes. I found it interesting.
Thank you, everybody.
I want to add into this that Charlie and I, as you may already be able to tell, we're good friends.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, and have been for many, many years.
And we've been friends for a long time. We took this on really as a labor of love because we really feel that the subject matter is something that people need to know more about. And we both want to thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Your signs in Beverly and Marblehead are intact. Thank you all. Thank you all.